So this is a piece of code that I saw on Stack Overflow, or at least a question that I saw on Stack Overflow, and the statement was that everything is greater than none in Python. And I'm going to open up a block of code so that we can see what this means. But basically, at least in Python 2, so in Python version 2, this works. And what this is that we could say that A and B, the variables A and B, are equal to 10 and 11. And then we could do a little test. So we could say that if A is greater than B, let's just go along and print A is greater than B, else print A is less than B. So we could run this code. This works perfectly fine in Python version 2, and it also works perfectly fine in Python version 3. Over here we can see that my version is 3.12. So it works in both versions, but more so this actually works in Python version 2, which is that if we replace this for a none, that this none in version 2, so in the previous version, which is now legacy, that got evaluated to 0, and A was greater than B because A would be greater, 10 is greater than none, if none was assumed to be 0. Now, when we try to run this in Python version 3, we don't get that as an answer. In fact, what we get is a type error. And the type error clearly states that the greater than sign is not supported between instances of int and none type, and we see that here we have a none type. So we can't compare an integer with none type in version 3, and the rationale for that is that it just doesn't make sense to compare. It's kind of like nonsense. In the upgraded version of Python, it's assumed to be nonsense, and that's quite logical in a way. So Python version 3, this fails with none type. So that's our type error, we get a none type. So we want to try and bypass in some way, and let's just modify or replicate this piece of code. So instead of having just this if statement now, how could we bypass this? And one thing that we could do, and you're welcome to put the comments in here, but maybe if we added an extra if statement over there, so something like if B is equal to none, then also let's just print A is greater than B, and then turn this second statement into an elif, and turn this third statement into an elif. Now this nested elif, this will catch the none, oh, actually, I have to conclude here with an else, not an elif. So else, there we go, that's perfectly fine. So now this none will be caught, and then we will get an A is greater than B here, because B will just be assumed to be 0, and then so long as our value of A was greater than 0, that would work. But then we would also need to assume in some way that A could not be negative. So we'll only work in certain cases. So we now get a working version. So what I'll do is I'll leave it for the comments as to other methods that you could use to assume that none evaluated to the number 0, but without reassigning B. So what we don't want to do, or what we want to make sure that we avoid, is some kind of check that if B equals none, that we reassign it to B equals 0, because that's actually changing the value of B in our code, and we don't want to be doing that, because we might use B later on in the code. But what we do want to do is just check that we are greater than none, and make the assumption that none is 0. So how can we possibly do this? in Python version 3, whereas this would have worked off the bat in Python version 2.